All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here during your lunch to learn about social housing movements in the United States. I am Tiffani McCoy. I'm the advocacy director at Real Change and also the campaign co-chair of House Our Neighbors, which is pushing for Initiative 135 in the city of Seattle to create the Seattle social housing developer. We just turned in more signatures and are impatiently waiting until next Tuesday when King County Elections resumes the signature verification to see if we made it onto the ballot. So we turned in over 7,500 more signatures. Those are all very, very carefully vetted, making sure they're completely legible, that they are Seattle registered, that they are Seattle voters. And just like any vagueness, we just didn't count those, but we still turned them all in. So actually the city clerk counted 2,000 more signatures than we had counted in our very stiff filters. So anyways, 9,500 signatures are on their way to King County Elections. We only need 5,033 of those to be eligible in order to make the ballot. Unfortunately, we will not be on the November ballot just based on the timeline of us getting our signatures in, but we're not at all like put off by that or thinking of like waiting until later. Like no one has time to wait to solve our affordability crisis. We continue to see more folks push into homelessness and more Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities pushed out and priced out of our cities. So we'll go forward on the February ballot and win and create this developer and make sure to change other things in our city that we need to make social housing completely successful. So I am just like super honored about the panel that we've put together today for you all. It's really kind of a neat constellation of viewpoints you'll hear today. So first we'll be hearing from Assemblymember Alex Lee. And just so everyone knows, Assemblymember Alex Lee will go first. He's got to leave at 12:30 to get back to the California House floor. So thank you for spending your like small break with us, like really appreciate that. And then we'll hear from Senator Stanley Chang from Hawaii. And then we will hear from Zachary Marks from the Montgomery County Housing Opportunity Commission. So that is an overview. We will then get into some audience questions and hear from those and then wrap up. And again, for everyone, this is recorded. We'll put it on our YouTube channel and on socials. So if you have to skip out early, don't worry about it. You can always watch this later. So I'm going to introduce our panelists and then we'll jump right on into Assemblymember Lee. Alex Lee represents California's 25th Assembly District, which includes Alameda County, communities of Fremont and Newark, and the Santa Clara County communities of Milpitas, San Jose, and Santa Clara. Assemblymember Lee was elected in 2020 and became the youngest Asian American legislator ever elected and the first openly bisexual state legislator in California history. He serves as the chair of the Select Committee on Social Housing, a transformative legislation he proposed, which we'll get into here shortly. So thank you again for being here. Next, we'll hear from Senator Stanley Chang. He represents East Honolulu, Diamond Head to Hawaii Kai in the Hawaii State Senate. After serving on the Honolulu City Council, Senator Chang was elected to the State Senate in 2016 as its youngest member. As chair of the Committee on Housing, Stanley pursued an innovative public housing program to solve Hawaii's decades-long affordable housing shortage. So thank you, Senator Chang, for being here. And then finally, we'll hear from Zachary Marks, who is the Chief Real Estate Officer for the Housing Opportunities Commission in Montgomery County, Maryland. In this role as the Chief Real Estate Officer, he is responsible for the Housing Opportunity Commission's property-related activities, including real estate acquisitions and development, property maintenance, property management, and asset management. So from Assemblymember Alex Lee, we'll learn about the social housing movement that just barely didn't get by this last session in California. We'll hear from Senator Chang, who was just successful after working on 4 years on Aloha Homes to create social housing in Hawaii. So, and then we'll hear from Zach Marks, and this is where in Montgomery County, Maryland, they've been doing social housing for 5 or 6 years. Maybe Zach, when we get to you, can clear up how many years exactly. So we're saying that a bit more explicitly, but so we'll hear about like a current movement, a movement that just passed in the state Senate, and then how social housing is actually already operating wildly successfully here on in the United States. So without further ado, we're going to turn it over to Assemblymember Lee. And just wanted to start by asking you were the prime sponsor and like helped to organize this rad coalition behind AB 2053. Why did you choose to sponsor it, and why now?
Yeah, well, I'm really pleased to be joined by folks from across this country right now working on the issue of social housing. Certainly, we're all in different time zones, but I think we're on sync that we need to have social housing in this country. We need to have an alternative to the for-profit market, and we need to make sure we're addressing housing insecurity and housing inaffordability. My district in the Bay Area is often seen as the epicenter of the housing unaffordability crisis. And even when I was running in my first election in 2020, I realized that we needed a different way. We needed new solutions where the government, the state got into the business of providing housing and social affordable housing for all income levels. And that's why we did it. So when we started, we just kind of faintly had the idea. We kind of knew about the term social housing. There were some white papers out there. And along the way, I met folks like Senator Chang and Zachary out there, and we started developing our bill. And we created, ultimately, in my first legislative session, AB 2053, which is the Social Housing Act of California, which would have created California Housing Authority, which would have been the public developer, which could have produced and preserved social housing across the state for all income levels.
Yeah, and Assemblymember, can you get into how, like, what the process was of writing AB 2053? I mean, this was at like the state level, like you said, like California, if I'm not mistaken, is like the 6th largest economy in the world. Like, what is what? Fifth now. All right. So yeah, what was the process of writing that, and how was such a broad coalition formed behind it?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly was not easy even coming up with the long bill that we have today. It was a lot of consultation with a lot of different stakeholders, a lot of different groups, and realizing that in the paradigm of housing politics and politics we have right now is every group kind of has different aspects they're more interested in, right? So with housing justice groups and tenant organizations, they're more interested in the rights of the residents in social housing. So they focus on that part. With our labor partners, especially in the construction trades, they're very interested in the production aspect of it, right? And even with other, say, local electeds and local government kind of interests, they're very fascinated about what the interfacing role between social housing agency and their own cities is, and really being able to think about what's the big overarching vision, and then working with those groups is really important. But we kind of started drafting it internally. Luckily, I was very heavily personally involved in this, and my background is that I was a legislative staffer for several years right before becoming a legislator myself. So we were very involved in drafting it. But ultimately, we drew from inspiration of Vienna, which is the European gold standard and the most well-known social housing example, perhaps in the world. And then, of course, we drew also from the Singapore model, which is the Asian gold standard of social housing. And we kind of merged that into the California context and see what works. You know, admittedly, a lot of the bill is obviously always a work in progress, but I think by the time we launched the bill in early 2022, it was a pretty comprehensive document outlaying a lot of things. There's still a couple bureaucratic kind of things in the California context we have to nail down, but I think we are going to be able to do that eventually. And really, then broadly speaking, why we got even people who are not traditionally in the housing space to get on board, like folks who are in our other labor unions, public sector and private sector unions, environmentalists, a lot of local electeds, and even a lot of other groups just across the political spectrum. Because especially in California, housing is a central issue. It is far too expensive to live in the communities that folks grew up in and created and built themselves. And there's nowhere else that is more acutely felt than in the Bay Area. where I represent. So I think a lot of people were very on board and excited about this issue. And as you see and you hear from a lot of experts from across the country, and even the efforts you're doing in the state of Washington, is that this movement is growing organically on its own. And I'm very proud to be playing the role in California to be pushing that forward. Because the most exciting thing is, once we snowball this from one state to the next, and you have enough, you really build momentum for the national change in national social housing, or even for the federal government to take a renewed interest in public housing and revigorating it so it's on par with our global peers. So that's really important. But I think really just a lot of it was us also reaching out to these groups. I mean, just it might sound very basic, but like reaching out to our labor union partners, environmentalists, and saying, this is really great because of this, and this is how it overlaps with what you want to do, right? When we talk to environmentalists, if you want to reduce carbon emissions, get people to drive less, and be able to do all these great things, which they all know housing affordability is a problem, we can have direct control over land use and direct control over, how we reshape our communities to be more climate friendly. This is it. This is the way to do it. And that's how we do things like that. We pitch them to groups that are obviously interested, but everyone at the same time understands housing is a big issue. It's just, how do you get them to come to the table, bring in the resources? Then that was the most useful part, I think.
Assemblymember, I actually don't know if we shared this with you, but when we were drafting the initiative for the charter for the public developer in Seattle, we actually used AB 2053 and like went through it and added to it and took out what wasn't relevant. Just it was a tremendous template for us to build off of. So
that's great. I'm very glad to hear. I hope that the way we structured the bill made it more readable and easy to pick and choose what you needed.
For sure. So yeah, getting into that, what was the process of passing AB 2053 through the Assembly, and like what ultimately got it held up in the Senate? You were so close, and I'm sure this is still probably a sensitive topic, but yeah, how was it, and was anything changed along the way, and would you do anything differently?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, when in the construction of the language of the bill, I do hope it was easy because I did write it deliberately in a way that the logic could flow. For all the policy nerds out there, there are a lot of bills that are written very incomprehensibly. Like you get the gist of it, but the flow logic isn't great. But I made it so that it would make more sense. Obviously, there's things I would tweak and improve still, but it's pretty good in that sense. And I think a large part of it is the term social housing itself for folks who are not obviously on the Zoom is still luckily politically and policy-wise a neutral term. Public housing, I think, for people does invoke certain ideas and images in people, depending on who the audience is. But you say social housing in people, I have noticed how it kind of can be anything. And we use that to our advantage, right? I think it's important that while we aren't reinventing the wheel globally, it is in a way new to the United States, new to California, and you take advantage of that, right? And you use that momentum on your side, where without mental barriers, I think people are more readily able to talk about new ideas. Because if you say public housing, someone has this thought in their mind, and you got to start changing and explaining it differently. In politics, we always say if you're explaining, you're losing, right? When it comes to social housing, I'm trying to help them reimagine what this idea is for them in their head. And I think that really helped us get all the way along. We got through the committees, we got off the assembly floor with more than a majority of the vote. And then we went to the Senate, and the Senate was where there were complications. We're still in legislative session, and I'm still not saying my bill is totally dead right now, because we're still working out some last minute things. But I mean, it stems from a lot of things in the universe of our housing discussions right now. It's very California inside baseball, but there are a lot of different housing bills right now with a lot of different issues and political issues. And my bill kind of got wrapped into that. Unfortunately, I think if there weren't certain bills out there right now, I don't think my bill would have the same problem. But that's politics, right? That's life. That's politics. That's just how it happens. But I think we got pretty close to where we needed to. If I could, I would have started lobbying certain legislators earlier on the Senate side. But I think we did pretty good job in so far as what we could control. Though I still am hopeful next 2.5 weeks of our legislative session that something could happen. But we're still working our way at it. Yeah.
And Assemblymember, this is an audience question that just came in that I think is important to highlight. What was the actual opposition? If I remember correctly from a couple of hearings, it was mostly realtors and potentially wealth investment folks. But yeah, what groups objected and what were their criticisms?
Yeah, the California Association of Realtors was the main opposition to this bill. You certainly had a lot of traditionally NIMBY groups who didn't like the idea of government produced housing in general. And they were more nakedly saying, these are the reasons we don't like it. The California Association of Realtors also did not like it because they viewed it as some sort of way in which they would not have ability to sell more units. Fair, unfair, I'm not entirely sure how that interpretation works because it's not like my bill is abolishing the private market of real estate, but they see it as a threat to their way of life, interestingly. So it's interesting because then their counterparts, usually they roll with the apartment association is supporting my bill. So they didn't have a cohesive on that front. And the apartment association, to their credit, I think, recognized perhaps economically in their self-interest, right? If you're not responsible for always providing housing for even the economically lowest folks, then that's a plus for them. And if we reach that agreement where it's like, well, it's in our both self-interest to house obviously more folks across this income spectrum, that's a good thing. And they recognize it's a good thing because they obviously want to house people of higher incomes. And that's the agreement we reached. And that's how you kind of build those coalitions. Like, what can you come together on terms of? And if they want to be supportive, that's great, especially of big new ideas like these. But there's a lot of opposition to this idea that, there's the first idea. The first idea that you have ever since, especially the Reagan era, is that just government doesn't work, right? Government can't do anything. The private market is so much better. The private industry, why should we do that? We should just let private development and everything take it away. We obviously are not seeing those results in this country, and we see very different results in countries that have a strong social or public housing role in them, especially in Europe and Asia. So there's that kind of just reticence to believe that government can work, when certainly we have proved a lot of examples nationally and states, in every state that government works perfectly fine. It's just those examples of that Republican or that conservative narrative rings true a lot. So we have to combat a lot of that. And then certainly there's just this idea that they don't want government building housing too. The second part is like they don't see that, they see it as un-American or something like that. So it is a paradigm shift in many ways. And then there's sometimes there's every interest group too within this coalition will have little things that they also care about. But I think the overarching problem we have is this belief that it can happen, right? This belief in the vision.
Yeah, I couldn't say it better myself. The belief in this vision and what can be if we work together. Again, I want to give you just a little bit of a breather before you have to get back to the floor. So final question, Assemblymember, what are your hopes for the future of California social housing in your bill, and what's next?
Yeah, there's a lot of things we can do that's coming up next. I am the chair of our select committee on social housing. So we've never had a committee dedicated solely to the topic of social housing ever, but we will. So in the coming year, we will be having hearings and tours and my vision is that the hearings will obviously be highlighting different aspects of social housing, hearing from experts even across the world, because now that we are all accustomed to the Zoom format, we can bring in experts from across the state that not only help educate and inform my colleagues in the legislature, but also the public and getting it out there. Because I think at the end of the day, all the work we're doing across the country really helps the movement, because the best case scenario is an American national social housing program. That's best case. A lot of our states obviously are concerned with the fact that we don't own our own money printer. This federal government does, and that would be really helpful to leverage that kind of economic power. But to build out that consensus. So the social housing select committee, we're going to be doing hearings and tours, and that's really important. Is like what I envision is every hearing and tour is to highlight an aspect of social housing, because we're constrained with more or less staying within the bounds of our own state. Is there a lot of things you can see, right? Like we can educate people about how has public housing within the constraints we have now been successful and unsuccessful. How can we look at proxies essentially to what we own in social housing? In California, we have the University of California system, or all the universities, and they go out and they build housing on their own. It's not their primary function, but certainly schools, districts, and universities are doing these things. And to walk legislators and folks through saying, look, government does build buildings and houses, and this happens here when you send your kids to school, like literally happening right now. And to demystify that and really talk about other mechanisms like funding, financing, comparative models to other countries, right? So it's really important to do that. And we do intend to obviously have another social housing bill in the next legislative session starting in 2023. So we'll keep working on this issue, keep hammering away at it. But I do take a lot of inspiration from, of course, like Stanley Chang, Senators Chang in Hawaii, their big win in the budget just this cycle in Rhode Island, what they're doing. So we can learn so much from each other, because when I started the bill, I did not know any other state that was working on any of these efforts. So now I think we have a really strong network to learn from one another.
Yeah, thank you so much. Assemblymember Lee, I'm going to give you a break. Really appreciate you taking the time and talking with us about your experience, and really glad to hear that this isn't the end, that you'll keep working at it, because this is truly like one of the last solutions we can put forward in order to ensure like deep affordability for folks. So thank you so much for your time and being here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on.
All right, we are going to go now to Senator Stanley Chang from Hawaii. Good morning to you, Senator. Thanks for being here. I would just love for you to jump right into what the Aloha Home legislation is that you've been championing for a couple years, and what does it aim to do?
Well, first, Tiffany, let me say thank you so much for having me on today. It is great to be here with other great champions like Assemblymember Lee and Zachary Marks. I introduced the Aloha Homes program because Hawaii has been suffering from a very severe housing shortage now for decades, for generations. And when I became the chair of the Housing Committee in the Senate 4 years ago, you know, people have a lot of gut reactions to housing. They have a lot of sort of intuitive thoughts of like what would solve the problem. But I thought to myself, you know, as was said at the Constitutional Convention, experience must be our only guide, for reason may mislead us. I actually wanted to see jurisdictions that had successfully solved housing shortages and what it was that they did, and not, you know, kind of theorize, but actually see in real life what they did. And so, you know, so I traveled to Singapore, I traveled to Vienna, two of the jurisdictions that Assemblymember Lee mentioned, and what they both did was social housing. And so we couldn't copy and paste everything, just, you know, that they did, but we did want to adapt it for the Hawaii context. And so what we came out with was a proposal called Aloha Homes, or Affordable Locally Owned Homes for All. And what it seeks to do is to, I think, implement three really basic principles when it comes to social housing. First of all, it is income blind. So it doesn't matter how much money you make, how much or how little money you make. Everyone is welcome equally, just like our public schools, our public parks, and our public highways. Number two, it wouldn't be rationed. So anyone who wanted it would get it. There would be no waiting lists, or only waiting lists in terms of waiting for the units to be built. Waiting lists would not be a way to ration the units. And it would be, you know, for ownership. It would be for local people who own no other real property, who are owner occupants, and who are Hawaii residents. So it would really focus on taking care of our own people. And, you know, once we started with those principles, a number of other principles followed, like to reduce costs. We would build on existing state-owned lands near the rail system that's currently being built, which would also help reduce automobiles and traffic, which is already a big problem here in Hawaii. It would also reduce carbon emissions, of course, which we're all concerned about. We also want to do a really dense construction model that primarily relies on walking rather than private automobiles, and that would be tightly integrated with public transportation, as I mentioned earlier. But even more importantly, I think that this, you know, this is a real paradigm shift in terms of how we think about urban planning. You know, in the same way that Steve Jobs was like, you know what, we don't need a separate stylus. We can just use our own fingers to access, you know, a handheld device like the iPhone. We have our legs, and we want basically a 5-minute walk to everything, including public transportation. So you no longer have to drive to the grocery store, or the pharmacy, or the post office, or the bank, or the dry cleaner. You would be able to take an elevator to all of those things, as is currently the case in a place like Hong Kong. And so, we over the years, it's gotten many refinements. It's gotten changed in innumerable ways. But I think these basic principles are still there. And in the legislation, the enabling legislation that we got passed this year in 2022, those principles are really still there. And I'm hopeful that we can make a big difference starting next year.
Yeah, can you remark on that too in this next question? The bill has passed, but yeah, when does it go into effect? Can you touch on that? And then just walk us through briefly the process over the last 4 years of getting Aloha Homes to pass. What, if any, changes were made to the legislation during those 4 years?
Well, it's been a long and winding road, Tiffany. And so, we understood that this was a big and ambitious measure. It's never been tried before in the United States. At least no one's even talked about it since President Truman in the 1940s, as Assemblymember Lee mentioned. So we had our big bill with all the bells and whistles in it, but we also had a number of skinny bills that would be just the enabling legislation without a lot of the protections and the bells and whistles that the advocates might be concerned about, or that the general public might be concerned about. And what we got this past year are a number of skinny bills. So one of them takes the main housing development agency of the state, HHFDC, or the Hawaii Housing Finance and Development Corporation. They're currently bound by a legal doctrine known as public lands, which limits the leases that they can issue to 65 years. And this year, we enabled them to issue leases for 99 years. So that's really based on the Singapore model of a 99-year leasehold ownership. We also gave Hawaii Public Housing Authority, which manages the existing federal public housing inventory, the power. So they only have the power right now to do federal public housing, which is highly regulated, which needs a lot of subsidies. And we gave them the power to do non-public housing. So for example, this would allow them to do housing that is not income restricted. And so that was a big step forward for them. So now we have 2 agencies that can basically build this model. We also got a $10 million appropriation for HPHA, the second agency, to build a first tower at an existing public housing site called Mayor Wright Homes that's currently undergoing redevelopment. And that is in really the heart of town, and would be an ideal place near a rail station, within walking distance and bus lines to every conceivable service. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that HPHA will be able to get that off the ground in the near future, because that site has been undergoing the redevelopment process now for a number of years. In addition, we got some other kind of unexpected wins as well, one of which was to allow the rental housing revolving fund, which is administered by HHFDC. And the rental housing revolving fund in Hawaii is currently really used to be a state match to federal LIHTC tax credits. So it gets a lot of money every year because developers are always lobbying for more state match to these federal tax credits, which, I understand. And so this year, the agency asked for, and we agreed to make the rental housing revolving fund available, not just for rental housing, but for any type of housing, including ownership housing of the sort that we're proposing. So that, that fund just got a $300 million infusion this year. So that's really a large amount of money, and the legislature has historically been funding it quite a lot. So that would be another large income source to build this type of housing. Finally, another model of housing that I only just really discovered, the University of Hawaii system, which, Assemblymember Lee also interestingly mentioned, they're building 2 new dorms, one at a former YMCA and one at a former federal site, both adjacent to the UH Manoa campus, without a subsidy, available to all, and without a profit also. So it's basically Aloha Homes because it's unsubsidized, so it's scalable. And there's no income restrictions. Dorms don't have income restrictions, and they're basically for residents. And the fact that they're getting off the ground with these public-private partnership, P3 partners in the private sector proves that it is possible to build unsubsidized housing, even in a very high construction cost state like Hawaii, because those two towers are actually happening without a taxpayer subsidy of any kind. And so that was very encouraging, because I think that'll serve as a positive model to our housing agencies to show them that really, hey, you say you need a subsidy, you don't really need a subsidy, because if the university is able to do it, you should be able to do it too. So the second part of your question was, what changes do we need to undergo? And so, I think one of the main changes that we needed to focus on actually from day one was to focus on the skinny bills rather than the whole comprehensive package. It's just very hard to pass a huge new program. I really have to take my hat off to Assemblymember Lee, because to create a brand new state agency is something that just doesn't happen very often. And I think there's a lot of institutional resistance to that type of thing. So, we really only found success when we scaled back to these skinny authorizing bills, even though they don't have a lot of the protections that we might want. Number one. Another was, and this is unique to Hawaii, but in Hawaii, there's an ongoing controversy with state-owned lands, where a lot of the current state-owned lands were actually a land corpus that was transferred, that was originally from the Kingdom of Hawaii, transferred to the Republic of Hawaii, then to the Territory of Hawaii, and finally now to the state of Hawaii. And a lot of Native Hawaiians believe that that corpus, the so-called crown lands, need to be preserved in perpetuity for a future Native Hawaiian self-governing entity. And so we needed to make the compromise that we would only be targeting state-owned lands that were not crown lands, that were not these so-called ceded lands. And so, that was acceptable to me. It wasn't acceptable to our agency partners initially, but, they, over the years, they saw that proposals to take the whole loaf basically were failing because of this intense opposition. And so they also softened their opposition this past year. So those are just a couple of the modifications, but honestly, this bill went through dozens, maybe 30 something changes over the years. And so, it was just a real work in progress, and that work in progress has not ended, because we still need to pass further legislation, in my opinion, in future years, to give those safeguards to people who are concerned about these units being snapped up by wealthy overseas investors, or also potentially the windfall profits that would come to the first buyers, who would then flip their units into the secondary market currently without restrictions. And so I think obviously that would be a concern that we would need to address, because they could make potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars in profit. And we're just giving the agencies a free hand here, which I don't think is consistent with what we're hearing in terms of community feedback.
Yeah, really important points there. And what do you think was what happened this year? What were the conditions that changed, or was it COVID, the pandemic going on, or just rising housing prices? What was the reason you think that it passed this year? Was there one specific thing, or just an amalgamation of?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so, maybe I'll get into a little of the inside baseball that Assemblymember Lee mentioned earlier. The political process is really not it is, it's been called sausage making. Donald Trump calls it a swamp. And those are all metaphors that I found to be extremely accurate. I think one of the big barriers was, on the societal level, there's no, social housing is it's a very different concept from what America has done historically for the last several decades. And so I don't think that even in the community, even among, the stakeholders who are very involved, like the developers, the labor unions, I don't think that there was a large, that there was a consensus or a clamoring for social housing. It's just too different from what they were, what they were used to. And that's why I found it very important. So in 2019, we organized a delegation to Singapore and Hong Kong. This year, as you know, we're organizing a delegation next month to Vienna to see the housing, because I think unless you can feel it and touch it and actually see the tenants and see that there are these towers, we're not this isn't Disneyland. We're not talking about Fantasyland. These are real cities that actually exist, that house, millions of people in social housing units. And I think people need to see that to make it a real idea. And so that's part of our efforts. We've held 3 conferences to try to spread these ideas. And so we got to continue that public education effort. Now, within the building, within the Capitol, there's a lot of, the state House leadership is very small c conservative. They don't believe in change. Basically, I think it's, if I could sort of armchair, quarterback things, I think they see their role in the world to, prevent the harebrained ideas of, ambitious, know-it-all, young senators from mucking up a system that's already working pretty well. And I understand that viewpoint. I think there are a lot of folks in the community who would agree with that, who especially our voter base older, which skews older, which skews with a very high percentage of homeowners. The system for them is really not broken. And I think that that's probably the viewpoint that is being reflected. But this past year, a couple of things, or, in 2022, a couple of things happened. Number one, the Speaker of the State House, came within 100-something votes of losing his election in 2020. And so I think this sort of resistance to change, I think, proved to be a political liability in a very tangible way. And the second issue was that the House Finance Chair, the most powerful member of the House, actually left her seat to run for Lieutenant Governor. And that was a very competitive race. She ended up winning, and the Speaker also ended up getting reelected. But she ended up winning, I think, in large part because the floodgates started to open, because they did allow a lot more progressive legislation through, like a significant increase in the minimum wage, large new appropriations for housing, and also, I would say, a lot of these, housing bills authorizing legislation that we just discussed. The floodgates really opened for those particular political reasons, not necessarily, I would say, because fundamental conditions changed, although, all the metrics have been getting worse. So it just becomes harder and harder to ignore this problem. But, that's the political reality, Tiffani, is that we have, there are big picture issues, but there are also small picture issues where individual legislators are often in the way of getting things done.
Yeah, it's just cool to hear your experience and Assemblymember Lee's, because you all are working through the State House, using your power as legislators to make change, structural, fundamental change for the betterment. We didn't want to take that avenue here in Seattle. We wanted to go through the initiative. We wanted people to recognize their power to build this broader movement. So lots of different ways that we are trying to tackle this problem. So I would love to hear what's next for Aloha Homes. Can you talk a bit about the implementation plan and timeline? Because I know for us, we are starting to get questions about implementation. And I'm like, look, I can't even think about that now. We just got to get this passed first. So would love to hear a bit more about that if you could shed some light.
Yeah. So, I think Aloha Homes, again, is a big, scary concept. It's this crazy idea that, public housing failed in America for many years. And, we're not Singapore, we're not Vienna, all these, resistance issues to, I think, the big comprehensive bill. So I think the next steps, I think, are going to happen in a fairly modest way. So I think HPHA will take the $10 million that we appropriated to them this year. And I think they'll start the first tower with 600 units of leasehold 99-year lease housing, no income restrictions. I think that once that hits the market, I think it's going to sell out immediately. I think there are going to be lines around the block for it. And I think that will prove one very important thing, which is to destigmatize public housing. Will middle-class people, will upper-middle-class people be willing to live in government housing, in public housing? The answer, I think, will clearly be yes, because it's going to be offered at a very low price. A recent state study showed that we'd be able to sell those units, or the cost to build a 2-bedroom unit would be about $400,000. And, a market price for a brand new 2-bedroom unit is probably in the $800,000 to $900,000 range right now in Honolulu. And if you're giving people a 50% discount, that product is going to fly off the shelves. And, you know, even wealthy people love good deals. And so I think that's going to be the first significant development, is that that project, I think, is going to sell out right away. And I think that's going to provide the momentum to do a second project and a third project and a fourth and so on. And so I think it's going to roll out step by step. I also think, so as we mentioned, there's an election this fall. The primary election just happened here in Hawaii, and the new governor coming in has a mandate for housing. Housing has been the #1 issue in the gubernatorial race this year, and all the gubernatorial candidates have been talking about their housing plans from day one. And I think the new governor is going to come in, and I think they're going to clean house, and I think that they are going to have a mandate to do a lot on housing. And I think they're going to, put some key personnel in the key agencies who are going to want to change, and who are going to want to try new things, and who are going to want to build more housing and actually to deliver on some of these campaign promises. We're currently in the last year of a lame duck termed out administration, and obviously the psychology is just not the same. I think a lot of those folks were more caretakers at this point than actually trying to launch ambitious new projects. But that window of opportunity for ambitious new projects is about to open with the new administration. So I think those two factors are going to come in. The governor is going to have the tools in the toolkit through that enabling legislation that we just passed to do basically, that those UH towers times 100 across this large state-owned portfolio with these two housing agencies. And, that's going to be the rocket fuel to really get this idea from just an idea to being fully rolled out. And I do think, 4 years is not a long time, but it's also not a short time on a political level. If I were to, if you were the governor, the new governor, and I were sitting across from you, I would say, Governor, you could make the following promises in your State of the State address in January. You could say that you will be handing out at least 500 new keys to the new buyers of these units before, the end of 2026, which would be your re-election year. You could promise that there would be, pick a high number, 20,000, 30,000 new units in the planning and design process by 2026. You could say, I want to break ground on 10,000 new units by 2026. These are tangible promises that are ambitious, but they are also now realistic if you put the full force and weight of your administration and your political will behind this. And, I'm hopeful that the new governor will have that, ambition.
Very cool. We're gonna switch over to Zachary Marks, but Senator, we do have like a couple specific questions for you, but if it's cool just to move along, I'll get to those when we do the group Q&A. So thank you for sharing all of that and all of your tremendous work. And
well, thank you so much.
Yeah. All right. Now we will hear from Zachary Marks. Just a reminder, because we're about 43 minutes in. He's the Chief Real Estate Officer for Montgomery County, Maryland's Housing Opportunities Commission. And an example that we here in Seattle with pushing for yes on I-135 use often to show how social housing is different and how it's being done already here in the US. So could you please start by talking a bit about Montgomery County? What's the population like in the housing market? One of the questions we get like right off the bat, oh, Montgomery County, it's not that comparable to Seattle as far as housing market. Could you shed some light on that for us, please?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for the opportunity to be a part of this. Montgomery County is one of the most affluent counties in the country. It's also one of the more diverse counties in the country. Being adjacent to the district, it's obviously got many ties in many ways to federal government and everything the federal government does, from defense to anything else, because it fits the travel budget of a HUD employee to get on the metro and come up to Montgomery County to figure something out. And the county itself's been on the forefront, sort of off and on, but it seems like every time something new's going on in affordable housing, you know, Montgomery County's somehow in the mix, sometimes on purpose and sometimes just because of its progressive roots. But I certainly think from the standpoint that it's a you know, it's a high cost, high rent county, and you know, it's a very attractive place to live. You know, we produce housing at an anemic rate, and so the housing affordability is as difficult in Montgomery County as it is really anywhere in the state of Maryland, and certainly you know, maybe not the gold medalist nationally, but for sure, you know, housing shortages very apparent here. So you know, I think it's, and you know, I don't necessarily think you need high rent, high cost to be the definition of a county for these things to work in. It's just not. I know oftentimes it feels, because of the cross subsidization sort of thinking, it sort of follows that you need high rents on the market rate units, but it's not really the case. I don't usually get into that just because I want to talk about the stuff that people agree on, and that isn't a little too academic, but the reality is you can do this stuff in any market where a private developer could make, you know, could make a multifamily property work. So
Yeah, thank you for that grounding, and like definitely am interested in getting to some of that academic stuff, but like maybe in small doses. So let's start first by talking about what the Housing Opportunity Commission is and how it functions.
yeah, so the Housing Opportunities Commission is really just the housing authority for Montgomery County. They renamed it in the 70s as part of a semi-repositioning, but really it's just the housing authority. We also happen to be a housing finance agency, which is an important piece to our success, but by no means is it necessary that, you know, these things be combined, because in most cases throughout the country you have, you know, much like in Hawaii, these are separate entities. The finance agency and the housing authority are separate entities. That's fine. It's just it's just an extra bureaucracy, but you know, we don't agree with ourselves all the time either, so it's fine. But that's what we are at our heart. And we initially, so sort of like, you know, HPHA and Hawaii, HOC started as a true public housing authority, where we were there to own the capital P, capital H public housing of old. But because we live in Montgomery County, over the decades, we sort of got into different programs, whether it was tax credit programs or whether it was other HUD programs. And over the decades, those programs come and go. We also came to sometimes got called in to acquire certain properties or step in and fix certain problems. And once we did that, we came to own those properties. So after many decades, our portfolio was had a high degree of diversity to it. We own single family homes, we own high rises. We're in the least affluent parts of the county. We're in the most affluent parts of the county. And so what sort of happened is, from those public housing roots, we came to be one of the larger landlords in the county. And really, there's almost no real estate you can own in Montgomery County that isn't valuable. It could be it could be a single family home in the worst condition, and it's still, you know, even the land itself is worth something. So, and because of the relative youth of Montgomery County, in the 50s and 60s, you know, indoor plumbing wasn't a guarantee, if you can believe it. But because of the relative youth, a lot of the assets that we came to own in the 70s and 80s are, you know, incredibly well placed. So it's in some ways the equivalent of what you're seeing in like Hawaii, where they happen to have some, a nice inventory of state-owned land. Certainly we have county-owned land here, and that's a resource, but it's definitely not as deep as some other states have, other counties have. And so we've been able to supplement that with just stuff that we've owned and acquired over the years.
Okay, so can you also just correct for the record, how long have you all been doing social housing? Do you call it social housing? It passed a couple of years ago through your county council. Like, can you just like shed some light on that aspect, like how it came into being?
Yeah, I mean, I know the Housing Production Fund passed actually just a year ago. But one of the things that it's helpful to understand about Montgomery County is that the Housing Production Fund was actually not engineered to do anything more than actually help HOC do more of what it had done for a long time. So, but I think your question about do we call it social housing is perfect, because we didn't really do this stuff over the last bunch of decades thinking, oh, we're inventing social housing or we're importing Finland or whatever. It was just this idea that there's a limit. There's a limit to the credit allocations you're getting. You know, the LIHTC credit allocations you're getting every year. There's a limit to volume cap. There's a limit to HUD subsidy, and everybody's already maxing that out. Everybody's already using that up. So, you know, these are just innovations over the years that HOC had done around cross-subsidization, but also because of its belief in a mixed income model. So this idea that, and it's frankly what is the most popular thing about social housing internationally. The reason it's so popular is because it's available to everyone. That by the reason public housing is so unpopular is because nobody can identify, right? Because there's such a narrow band of people who could live there from an income standpoint. So it's just something that HOC had done for other reasons over the course of many decades. So I think beginning in like maybe the mid 80s, HOC started doing these mixed income developments where the market rate units were owned 100% by HOC. And that's been happening for decades. We have a high rise in downtown Bethesda that I think we built in the early 90s. And, you know, it's got a pool on the roof and it's downtown Bethesda and the rents are top of a market. And if you ask people where they live, they'd tell you the name of the place and would never believe that this was governmental owned housing. And for the most part, HOC never tried to disabuse anyone of that notion. But most, you know, the majority of our portfolio is simply unrestricted housing that HOC owns. And it uses, you know, all that cash flow gets poured back into the agency to do all the other stuff, to serve people up and down the rental spectrum. So to sort of just tie back really quickly, really the HPF, the Housing Production Fund, came about because a year ago, the council said, we love the stuff you guys do, but we're nowhere near meeting our annual housing goals. So what could we give you that would help you meet it? Because again, everybody's already maxing everything out. So the private sector is providing about 40 to 50% of what the county needs in terms of its housing goals. And it's not going to do more than that without substantive changes in the economics of things. So they're doing what they're doing. And the only way you're really going to get the other 50 is to to energize other players in the market. And it just so happens that they have HOC, a public agency that already has a track record for doing really large mixed income projects, many of which do not use those dear finite resources to do it. And so the HPF was designed to do two things. One, it's the P, that's the production. One, how do we get you to do way more than you're doing right now? Because you're doing some and it's great, but how do we get you to do more? So the HPF was the answer. And the second was, how do we structure it in a way that you can avoid using those other resources that we're already maxing out as seldom as possible. And so it was so successful that they did a $50 million installment initially, and they came right back this latest budget year in May, June, and gave us another 50 because it had been so successful right out of the gate.
Yeah, that's amazing. And how like it just came about, it sounds like quite organically, just we have these tools, we can implement them. We don't have to be restricted by like what the federal government is willing to like finance year to year or give states and localities. So that sounds like a natural progression. I wish that was happening more nationally, but we're going to get to one of my favorite questions, Zachary. So when we've been talking to folks here, and I'm not an economist, I'm not going to pretend to know a lot of these terms, but people here have like flippantly been saying like, what's the secret sauce? What's the secret sauce of social housing? Tell me how this actually is funded. And like getting back to what Senator Chang was saying, like this isn't Disneyland, this isn't like this magical universe where we just have to be like taxed so heavily in order to have housing that meets our income levels. So like, can you dispel the secret sauce for folks here in Seattle? How does the financial model of social housing created by the Housing Opportunity Commission work?
Yeah, I mean, it's, Assemblyman Lee said at the top something that just, and he had said it once or twice before in other places, other articles and so forth, but that I just think is so important. And it really is just government self-belief. We've had generations of the idea that, as he said, government can't possibly do these things. And so the funny thing about the HPF, the Housing Production Fund, is it's the most basic, affordable housing finance is always just this bizarre mousetrap of mechanics. And what's hilarious about the HPF is it's like this most stone simple thing on earth, which is, especially in these high, I mean, almost by definition, most of the time, these high rent municipalities, jurisdictions have really high bond ratings, and it doesn't take, you don't actually need a lot of, this is going to sound insane, but you don't actually need a lot of money to solve the housing crisis. We were pitching the HPF just before COVID hit, and we got the first HPF chunk approved in the middle of COVID, or middle of the last 2 years of COVID. And so we actually were really focused on making it seem like they were almost spending nothing, which is absolutely not a requirement, by the way. But that was where we were. I mean, you talk about politics. Politics is also timing, of what's going on in the world at the time. And so we just focused on showing the county that it could help us produce a significant amount of housing with really the like lightest of touches from their budgetary appropriations. And so, and in terms of like what the model is, because there's often, I think Senator Chang referenced this, but this idea that like, we're not actually going to ever import these communist international spaceship models. Like they're just not coming to Cowboy USA. It's just not going to happen, right? And so what I tell people is like we have taken the private, it's the private model, except there's not a private owner. That we're kicking out the institutional investor and we're replacing it whose money is really expensive, as you might imagine. Those penthouses aren't going to pay for themselves, so they're going to kick out that capital. And you're going to replace it with what high rent jurisdictions often have, which is a very low cost of capital. And so the way our fund works, the county wound up appropriating $3 million a year for 20 years to create a $50 million revolving fund. Because we were in the middle of COVID, we pledged to pay 5% on that money and send that interest back on an annual basis to the county. So that's $2.5 million. So this $50 million fund is costing the county $500,000 a year, which is, I don't even think I think they just cut it off at that point. Like, I don't even think they look at stuff that small. Kidding. But we wanted to show them something that, because of the uncertainty around budgets in the middle, early on in COVID, that we wanted to give them something that basically had a very light impact on the budget. But that $3 million pays the principal and interest on the $50 million bond issuance that created the fund. But the idea that for $500,000, a year for 20 years, that we could create thousands of new units, and do so without other resources that they would typically give us. So this is expansionary. That was something that was really exciting. And so I think honestly, the secret sauce is just realizing that governments are very powerful institutions, and they've been somehow convinced, like negged into the idea that like they can't do any of this, and that they don't have the money, and that they can't attract talented people to come do this. I mean, I watch people design the entire Amtrak system in crayon on Twitter for nothing, and like you're saying that people won't, you tell them you have this big bucket of money, and you're going to build a 600 unit tower in Hawaii, and you're not going to attract real estate professionals to come work for HPHA. I mean, you're going to be able to do this. So I really think that's it more than anything else, because the financing is very straightforward. It's replacing expensive capital with cheap capital and putting the government in ownership as opposed to private equity in ownership. And we do lots of we do transactions with private equity. They're good partners, but they're not going to deliver. You can't do it at this scale at those prices.
Thank you for distilling that down, I think, into digestible chunks. Before we move back into like questions for the both of you, do you mind just because, so Zachary, like for the initiative we're working on in Seattle, all new builds are required to meet passive house standards. If I understand correctly, one of your most recent developments is going to be passive house standard. Do you mind just talking about that development, and is passive house standards adding exorbitant cost to the project, and what is the like AMI roughly that you're going to be able to serve with this new unit?
Yeah, so if you all are cribbing our HPF, we are just completely cheating off your homework when it comes to passive house. We had to actually go get an architect who worked in Seattle in order to have anybody that knew how to do passive house here on the East Coast. As you may know, we lived 10 years in the past behind you. So this passive house we're doing, it's actually the two buildings, both are passive house, and then we're putting a ton of solar on a very unfortunately large parking deck to absolve ourselves, but that solar is being pointed at the one of the buildings to make it net zero. And I know that also it sounds pedestrian to you all over there, but that's a big deal around here. And that's part of what we're trying to show by achieving these. If the housing authority can do it, then surely somebody else can. And so we really are trying to set an example, which is really how HOC approaches policy. People ask us for our input on policy discussions, which is fine, but for the most part, we try to help policy by to Senator Chang's point. It's so much easier. The conversations are so much shorter if you can just walk somebody inside a building, and it is a completely different animal when you can say, when people are like, arguing over hypotheticals, you just hold on, go inside there, take a look around, tell us what you think. And then let's talk. And so that's the same idea here, that this is a very big step forward in Montgomery County, delivering these buildings. Our sense is that the passive house premium is probably somewhere between 2 and 5% just on costs. Our architect also had a location in Pittsburgh, and Pennsylvania happens to be a place that does a lot of passive house because they stuck it in the LIHTC QAP. And if you tell LIHTC developers that you get points for something, they will do it, even though they don't know, even if they don't know what you mean. They will still check the box and do it and figure it out maybe. But the result is that they have really good comparable data on cost, because they had LIHTC deals that use passive house and some that didn't, but they're all basically the same size, and you're getting the same, they're hitting the same AMIs and all that stuff. So, and from that data and from other data, it seems pretty clear that the premium is not particularly large. It's 2 to 5% if you're being, if you're trying to be like super fair. But the reality is that's just the cost. Once you factor in payback, and from our perspective, because we're long-term holders, a 5 or 7 year payback is amazing, because we plan on holding this about infinity years more than that. So in terms of a payback, you get net positive. And then, the advent, it's sort of like the I get disoriented still when, Senator Chang's talking about how everybody has to have a housing policy. And I'm just disoriented because nobody cared forever. And now everybody's talking about housing, and so we get a little woozy. We're like, did we wake up in an alternate universe? But that's what's happening, but it's also happening on climate. And so, the Inflation Reduction Act that just passed has all kinds of incredible tools to where it will actually now be, there will be no premium. There'll actually be a discount because of everything in that bill that around, heat pumps, electrification, direct pay on solar. So it's not even a premium anymore. And as a result, the AMIs are much more a function of, so it's really not a cost additive. So it really doesn't have any role in, other than it actually creates a better operating asset from a utility perspective. So it doesn't prevent a single unit from being, less affordable. The affordability on these projects is really a subject of which resources we're bringing to the table on those deals, and and balancing it with all these other goals. At this particular project, we have units from 30% AMI to market rate. And there are some other things you can do. You could pair, there's Faircloth to RAD, you could pair it with that and bring actual new subsidy to it. So there's lots of ways to do it. The HPF is not a silver bullet. It's not saying all these other programs are terrible and you shouldn't do them. It's just another tool in the toolkit to be sometimes stacked with those, sometimes not.
Excellent. It sounds like we have some research then to do on Pittsburgh. So thanks for that homework. I'm going to go to both of the panelists and just open it up for questions. And I have two first, and I'm going to start with Zachary on this one. So Zachary, why do we need social housing? Why do we do what you all are doing in Montgomery County? Shouldn't we just boost funding into LIHTC and Section 8 project-based vouchers? Like, shouldn't we just all go to the federal government and ask for more? Or should we just why not incentivize the private market more? Why do we need social housing?
Yes, do any and all of those things, it's all fine. But in terms of volume, vouchers are amazingly useful, but you still need supply. The LIHTC program is fine, but nobody's doing that. Nobody's actually increasing the funding to LIHTC, and it is those are highly difficult, projects to execute. If what we're seeking to do is solve a problem, not all problems, but we view it as primarily the solution to the supply issue. We do everything else. We serve more people at 0% AMI than anybody else in this county. We do all the other things because they're all important, but the HPF is designed really first and foremost to solve the production problem. And the best way to produce is to simplify. The hardest thing to do around simplification is how do you ensure to your constituents that you're not giving the farm to the private sector. And so, having a very simplistic mechanism around finance and then pushing that through a governmental entity and ensuring that value stays inside the governmental apparatus. What you need is speed and volume, and it's very hard to do that if you have significant private involvement because of the issue in the value, not in the process, but in the value, because people start rightly asking questions like, what's the right balance? So I would say that's that's what we're trying to do here. It's not that we're not trying to do the other things or that the other things aren't important. They are crucially important. But in terms of, supply, if you want to get there as fast as possible, there's, in many cases, the governmental developer will wind up being the biggest developer in these jurisdictions. We're actually fairly close already. So, people look at these large private developers and think, you could never do what those big guys do. But the reality is, very quickly, I think you look at places that do social housing, the largest developer in all those places is the government, and that's what would happen here too, because of the ability to push, because of the simplicity and the confidence around where the value is going. So
Thank you. So it sounds like a yes and approach, which is what we're pushing here. We need those tools and we need this if we're like truly serious about solving the affordability crisis. All right, Senator Chang, same question to you.
Oh yeah, I completely agree with everything that Zachary just said. We do need to do all of the above. So, in Hawaii, there are 18,000 local babies born a year. And so we produce maybe about 2,000 units on average per year, of which, there are subsidized units maybe averaging around 700 a year. So like that's the bottom, 5% or so are being taken care of. And then at the top, there's another I don't know, maybe 10%, the top, where the private sector is building. So in the middle, you have like 85% of the market is being unserved. So obviously the people at the bottom need to continue to be taken care of, but that 85% in the middle is really the key. I also want to, I'm not saying LIHTC is a bad program. I'm not saying Section 8 is a bad program. They're certainly better than nothing. But if you study your history, you'll see what I'm talking about here. So originally, Truman and Johnson in the 40s and then in the 60s wanted to build a ton of housing, kind of like what Zachary is doing. The federal government was just going to build a ton of housing. They were going to pay for a ton of housing. That's what the Great Society was. Almost immediately, the Ford administration comes in, and Republicans then, being like Republicans today, were like, well, no, we don't want the government to do it. We want to take this money that is currently housing people directly by the government, and we want to create this new program called Section 8 and give it to private landlords. So instead of just directly spending the money to house people who need it, we're going to give it to the private sector landlords. And then LIHTC comes about in the Reagan administration, Reagan, being a Republican and Republicans then and now also being pro-private sector. He said, instead of us, the federal government, building new housing, we're going to take that money that we would be spending to build more housing, and instead we're going to give it to the private sector developers. So frankly, these two programs are just gigantic giveaways to private sector landlords and developers. And it's slightly, there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance for myself as someone on the left whenever I hear people saying we need to do more for Section 8 and more for LIHTC. I mean, I don't disagree, but they're huge giveaways to private sector developers and private sector landlords when the government could just be doing it directly, like Zachary was talking about. Why do we need these middlemen to come in and enrich themselves at the expense of the taxpayer? Another example I often use in Hawaii is, we have a very high rate of private school attendance. And I'm sure that, I know DC has a very high rate of private school attendance too. I'm not sure about Seattle, but programs like these tax credit programs like LIHTC are basically giving money to private schools to give scholarships to poor kids. But the private schools are never going to be able to educate everybody. Why not just create public school? And that's what the Singapores and the Viennas have done, is they've just created public school. The private sector is still there. In Vienna, in Singapore, you can still build and get rich as a private sector developer, building for the very top of the socioeconomic ladder. But for the vast majority of people who are not, the crazy rich Asians or whatever, they can simply go to public housing and have their needs taken care of in a well-maintained, well-designed, well-built housing project. And that's the real solution. Instead of trying to commandeer the private sector, just have the public sector do it.
Yeah, totally agree. We have other programs here in Seattle, like rapid rehousing to get folks who are on the verge of becoming homeless or who are homeless rapidly into housing. And I mean, that's a great program. We need to keep that as long as we can, but why not just put that money directly into a public good and support it that way, as opposed to lining private developers and landlords' pockets. Like, we need to, like you're all saying, we just need a massive paradigm shift. And Senator Chang, you brought something up, which is the next question I have, and I'll start with you and then go to Zachary. Here in Seattle, I'm sure you've heard this where you all are. Some affordable housing folks say that we shouldn't be subsidizing those with higher incomes. I love the term that you use, Senator Chang, like your income invisible. We do here in the public developer proposal go from 0 to 120% AMI, but in reality, like it doesn't restrict anyone. It's just like we want to like highlight and make sure that those 4 income buckets are served primarily. So what would you say to these folks who think that this is a tax giveaway, that public money is going to subsidize higher incomes?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, the short answer is public services are for the public. To restrict based on income, I understand that, even Vienna and Singapore have various income restrictions, but income restrictions are actually, I would say, a right-wing talking point. During the middle of the pandemic, when Congress was debating giving these $2,000 stimulus checks, it was Mitch McConnell that wanted those stimulus checks only to go to people below making less than $100,000 or whatever, right? Because Republicans understand this very critical piece of the puzzle, which is what they used to say in Washington, and maybe they've forgotten nowadays. A program for the poor is a poor program. It's exactly what Zachary was saying earlier. If you restrict a program to a very small segment of the population, then only a very small segment of the population is going to support it. And everyone else is not going to support it, basically. And so, often, people are like, well, why don't we restrict to first-time home buyers? Or why don't we restrict to, the people who really need it? And I've knocked on 35,000 doors in my district. The vast majority of my voters are homeowners. Okay, I often say there are 2 kinds of people. There are renters and there are voters. And in Hawaii, most voters own their own homes. So why would I create a program that just excludes all of my voters? That is politically suicidal, right? I think, if you look at like the empirical examples, all the top programs at the federal and state and county levels are income blind, right? Medicare and Social Security are the top expenditures of the entire federal government. And Medicare and Social Security are for everybody. Even Donald Trump gets Medicare and Social Security, right? Defense would come in at number 4. Defense protects rich and poor alike in this country. At the state level, at the county level, at the school board level, public education is for everybody. Public highways are for everybody. Public parks, public libraries, public services are for everybody. In America, this is a country where we are all equal. And, if we're talking about, say, Section 9 public housing, the traditional public housing, that serves what, like 3% of this country's people, like the low single digits, probably in every state in the country. I don't know exactly what socialism is, but serving 3% of the people is not socialism. That is the opposite of socialism. Socialism is for everybody. And so I would say, the more we dig ourselves into this hole of like, just, it would be like proposing a new school system that's only eligible for people making less than, a certain percentage of AMI, or building universities for which only certain people making under 60% AMI are eligible. Why would we do that? That's not American. It's not progressive. It's this weird, income restrictions are actually really weird, and a really weird byproduct of I would say some really misguided. I think income restrictions are the principal reason why federal housing policy has failed over the last 80 years. Everything at the federal level has had an income restriction since day one, and we've seen where that's gotten us. So why would we repeat this failed experiment?
Totally. Yeah, Zachary, same question to you. What would you say to folks who say we shouldn't be subsidizing those that have higher incomes?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because we don't. We take their money. That's our model. But I have to say, we're often, my team is on, we really are most of the time just head down trying to put stuff up in the air. And so when I hear, it's when I hear Senator Chang talking about how, this is really a public utility thing, and public utilities, you don't you're not income qualified for water, right? So, and I honestly, I have to say, like, it's not something I've ever really thought about in that way, and it resonates. And I think you want to talk to homeowners in a language they understand, talk about schools, right? Like, that's in Montgomery County, the value of your home is based on your high school cluster. So you start talking about things like that, and they absolutely understand it because it's the center of thought. So we've never thought our model is the best or the only or anything. We just do it in a different way. We take if you are of a higher income, you can come live in our market rate unit and pay us your money, and we'll take that money and we'll repurpose it. But it's the same idea. And I think the argument against our model and for the other one is that the most important thing to solving the housing crisis is speed. And if you are not, I think one of the reasons the income qualification thing is so damaging is because it slows things down. Again, probably by design. I think that's what the senator's about to tell me. That's probably by design, as he blows my mind on these other things. But I think the most important thing to solving this crisis, because the most justifiable criticism I hear from folks is like, that's great, you're building housing that's going to help us in 10 years, which is not that untrue, right? But so it's got to be about speed. And I think getting rid of income qualifications, pricing things at cost. These are people that are primary owners that are living in your community. And if they're, if their housing is less of a burden, they're still there spending their larger discretionary income in your area. But I think prioritizing speed is probably the most important thing you can do in any of these housing programs.
Yeah, thank you so much for both of those answers. I'm gonna turn over to a couple audience questions. We have 8 minutes left, so we'll try to hit one for sure, maybe two. The first one is for you, Senator Chang. How will Aloha Homes ensure that its social housing is not converted into Airbnbs like so many homes have been on the Kailau beachfront? Will there be any additional supports for residents alongside social housing to make sure they can keep themselves above water economically without having to rely on undesired income like Airbnb?
So that's a really complicated question in Hawaii. And I have a few different answers for it. So, our first answer is, okay, so you really don't like Airbnbs, right? You really, really don't like Airbnbs. All right, that's your number one priority, because I have the answer for you. The answer is, and we actually wrote this into the big bill, which didn't pass. But we live in the year 2022. Verifying the identity of everyone who walks through the lobby of a Aloha Homes tower is the easiest thing to do in the world. You can have retina scans, you can have fingerprint scans, you can have other biometric means of ensuring that every single person who walks through that lobby is either the owner occupant or their guest and nobody else. Right? If you're an illegal Airbnb tenant and your fingerprint is not in the database, you will not be permitted entry past the turnstile or the gate or whatever. Right? Now, a lot of people would say, oh, wait a minute, that's going way too far. Okay, so, well, then if other things matter to you other than that, then, you could water down the 100, that gets you to like pretty close to 100% enforcement, but we can water that down. We can have like a front desk person, to screen people and to say, oh, I don't recognize you. Are you a resident? What unit are you in? And then, do it a little bit softer. Now that will lower the enforcement efficiency and efficacy rate. But maybe that's not quite as, drastic as a biometric type of screening measure. To address kind of the second part of the question about, the income streams, the key here, this is kind of a delicate balance, because you want to price the housing at a low enough price to be accessible to most people. But you don't want it to become a prison for them where they have no mobility afterwards. So a recent state study found that we could build a 2-bedroom unit for $400,000. According to federal AMI standards in Hawaii, that is affordable to a family of 4 making 56% of AMI, which is really low, actually. That's like LIHTC low. And so if you get in, if you get in, are you just trapped there because you'll never be able to resell your unit for a profit and then move elsewhere if you need to, get a bigger unit, for example? That I think is the subject of 2 different conflicting, impulses. On the one hand, we don't want units to be flipped into the secondary market for huge prices. But on the other hand, we want people to build wealth and security through these low-priced units. A lot of people who talk about like racial wealth gaps in this country point to the fact that it was home ownership that made the Caucasian community in this country much wealthier than minority communities in this country. So are we basically reserving for minorities a form of housing that will never give them access to, a nest egg and saving for retirement and generational wealth and so on? Because I don't think we want to achieve that either, right? So in Singapore, what they do is basically they allow you to collect that windfall profit. You buy in at the low government price, but you can you can sell it after 5 years for a totally unrestricted free market price. And there are units that initially sold for in the $200,000 plus range that are now selling in the $1 million plus range. And again, these are public housing units. So these are truly, stigmatized units. If people in the open market are willing to pay $1 million for a public housing unit. And then people are like, okay, but wait a minute, now those public housing units are no longer affordable, right? So what Singapore does is, well, those units are no longer affordable, but we want them to be no longer affordable because we want to enrich the low income people who are buying them. But every successive new generation of low income people, or all income people really, will have access to brand new units that are still at a low subsidy. And so that's why a key feature is no rationing. Everybody gets one. So you may, yes, there will be people getting windfall profits, but everyone can make a windfall profit if they choose to sell. And if they choose not to sell, they can just stay. And, their units around them might be getting flipped for $1 million. But they have no pressure to move because they're owners, they're not renters, their rent is never going to go up, and they can stay put with absolutely no pressure around them. So again, it's very counterintuitive based on existing American models where we have this scarcity mentality, where we try to preserve affordable housing, where we try to keep affordable housing affordable. But it turns out that that's exactly wrong. And that's why I think it's so important to actually see and feel and touch a system that actually works. Because, again, experience must be our only guide, for reason may mislead us.
Yeah, so we have 2 minutes left and we're gonna close it there. Just like huge thanks to both of you for taking time out of your schedules to come and share your lessons learned and how you're addressing the affordability crises in your areas. We're gonna put in the chat right now, Real Changes Comprehensive Plan Alternative 6, hoping folks can go upvote that, as I'm sure Zachary and Senator Chang would agree with, that social housing is one aspect, but we also need to get rid of redlining. We need to challenge how we've segregated our cities. We need to upzone. We need to allow for a lot more mobility of folks on bikes and pedestrians. So we're trying to make sure that the comprehensive plan that will navigate the Seattle for the next 20 years, that it's not just basic milquetoast changes. So make sure you go into that link and upvote Real Changes social housing proposal and look for other things from like Share the Cities as well. So thank you again both so much for being here, and appreciate your wisdom, solidarity, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much.